Okay, everyone, it's time to get started. Welcome to track 4, 11 o'clock session, last session before lunch. My name is Jason Scott. I'll be your host for today. I'm going to introduce MacLeod Bracken. He's a cybersecurity consultant with Insane Cyber. He's going to talk about the network baselining Odyssey. As a cybersecurity professional with a focus on industrial control systems, MacLeod holds degrees in computer science and cybersecurity. His experience includes research on cyber attacks at Idaho National Laboratory and working on various cybersecurity projects as a consultant, addressing challenges in network baselining. MacLeod, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So before I kick this off, I'm going to let you guys know I am on a tight schedule running this thing, so I am not going to be taking questions through the presentation, but at the end, I'll have time for anyone who wants to ask anything. So to hop right into it, maybe. Yeah, I do have a laser, but the laser unfortunately will not change my slide. Yeah, so like you said, I got my degrees in computer science and cybersecurity at the University of Tulsa. I was at INL before I came to Insane Cyber now. I work as a consultant at Insane Cyber, and I was a control systems analyst at INL as an intern. And we will now hop into the presentation. So, to give you guys an overview of the things that I want to touch base on in this presentation, we're going to be discussing network baselining as a general concept. Everybody has a lot of different definitions of what network baselining is, how it can apply to their individual networks, and what exactly it looks like in your environment. So I am going to present some different ideas of categorizations, types of baselining that you can do when you're looking at addressing a network for the first time. And we're going to talk about some of the tools, and then much like Homer's The Odyssey, hence the title, we're going to be talking about some of the challenges and solutioning to those challenges that come up as you are working through the network baselining process. So to get into it, first thing that I want everybody to be able to get out of this presentation is I want everybody to have a definition of baselining. We don't have to agree on what that definition is, but I think that everybody here either has an idea of what baselining is going into it, or if you don't, you should when you leave. I'm hoping to at least influence that idea a little bit as we go through this presentation. We're going to talk about some of the categories that I have personally identified in network baselining and their individual pro-cons as compared to one another. Then we're going to be talking about the costs associated with those baselining options, and we're going to be talking about some, again, of those common challenges and the ideas behind them. I have them categorized, and then I get into some of the more specific issues in those categories. So, what is baselining? That is, baselining is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and it really can be defined in a variety of different ways depending on what your individual use case is, what you're trying to do in your network. And so starting off here, we obviously have like a host to host based baseline there, where we can look at just representing connections as IP to IP, and we don't necessarily have to get deeper into that than IP to IP if we don't want to, but if we want to bring in protocol, talk about TCP, UDP, ICMP, just at a base level of, hey, it's not just an IP to IP connection, but let's bring in that context of what protocol are we talking over. Then we can jump into what ports are we talking over and what services are associated with those ports. And if you want to get even more defined than that, we can talk about, hey, we're going to look at a device type to device type connection, and we're going to qualify what application-specific protocols are going on between those devices. And where this differs from services is, rather than just saying, hey, we're looking at port 80 HTTP, I might be looking at port 502, here's Modbus, what function codes are being run? What exactly is that Modbus traffic doing, and how can I categorize and divvy up, separate what that Modbus traffic looks like as pertaining to different devices? And so looking at these different definitions, of baselining. I mean, these are obviously not the only ways to do it. You can mix match, do all sorts of other things. You can bring in additional context, additional information. But looking at this, the idea of baselining is really you're wanting to build a broad expectation of what network traffic looks like in your given environment. Right? So when we are considering that, we want to consider what information is relevant to us when we're establishing that broad expectation. And the more detailed we get, and I'll get to this a little bit more later, the more detailed we get, usually the higher the cost is with establishing that baseline. So why do we care? Why are we doing baselining at all? What's important about it? Well, it really depends on your individual application, but looking towards network security, which is why a lot of us are here, it can be really helpful for looking through and identifying potential anomalies, things that are not associated with the baseline in your network. Hey, this is some anomalous traffic we're expecting. Once we have a baseline, we can say, hey, this is what we're expecting to have happen. Here's some traffic that doesn't fit what we've modeled. What is it? Why is it anomalous to the baseline that we've established? And how can we help either integrate that into the baseline that we have happening, or if it is actually genuinely unexpected traffic, why is it occurring? Test. Okay. But yeah, you can also use it for network enhancement. In a lot of cases, especially on larger networks, networks that are scaled up quite a bit, you may have choke points where you have resources that are being constrained, either maybe possibly going through a certain device if you have like an API endpoint that's getting overwhelmed, or some other kind of device that is getting an ingress of traffic that it can't keep up with. Doing a baseline can be very helpful for identifying those points where we have more incoming traffic to devices than we have outgoing, and we're expecting that flow to look about the same over a period of time. And so they can really help you identify some of those performance issues that you're having, so that you can go ahead and remediate them and hopefully bring your network back to where you're hoping it can be. So I will say, one of the things that I'm going to heavily differentiate between as I go over this is there is a big difference between doing baselining in an IT network and in an OT network. IT networks are very loud. There's a lot of chatter, a lot of difference in the kind of traffic that you'll see. It's very high variance traffic, whereas in OT networks, it tends to be a lot more controlled. Hopefully, it should be more controlled. So when we're looking at OT networks and doing baselining in them, we can get a lot more specific without necessarily as much cost as we would have in an IT network, and we don't necessarily have to account for that high variance traffic. And as a result, baselining tends to be more effective in OT environments than it is in IT environments. But again, really depends on how you model it. So I alluded to talking about types of baselines a little bit. And so I have three categories here that we're going to talk through. I know this is not a small table, but I promise we'll get through it. So looking at the first type of baseline that I've sort of identified here is it's the overview type of baseline, right? And when we're thinking about what does that look like, we're thinking of those, just general IP to IP baselines, IP with port protocol baselines, and looking at some of the statistics maybe related to throughput, overall traffic size, what's the data flow through the network actually look like. And so we're just trying to get a very high level view of what's going on in our network, what's communicating with what, and we don't necessarily care about some of the particulars there. We might bring in ports and just look at what services are going on between these machines, but generally we're just trying to get a basic idea. The pros of the overview type of baseline is it's very easy to implement, and the rules that are associated with overview baselining can be very broad. You don't have to get super specific with what you're looking for, what you're expecting in your network when you're trying to establish this baseline. The cons with it is it tends to be very inaccurate when it comes to especially those louder IT networks. And as a result, There is a lot of noise associated with an overview type baseline. There's a lot of things that will probably fall outside of it unless you have it so broad, and at that point, then you're having noise in the opposite direction, which isn't necessarily noise, but instead things that you're missing. You're missing a bunch of potentially malicious traffic or just otherwise anomalous traffic to what you're actually expecting because you wrote your baseline in such a way that it is very broad. And we will get into how we can map this into detections and the types of detections that fall into these categories. That will be the next thing that I go over after we're through this slide. And then, of course, the other thing that's bad with the overview type of baselining is we're going to miss all those specific signatures. If we're looking for specific pieces of malware, if we're looking for specific traffic patterns associated with a threat actor, we're not going to have a good view of that when we're doing an overview baseline, unless, of course, that traffic falls outside of our expected, our general expected traffic. So, moving on into the next type. These next two types are actually very closely related to one another. They're both pattern-based typing, and I particularly label them as positive space and negative space pattern-based baselining. And so the primary difference between them is that while they're both pattern-based in concept, the positive space pattern-based baselining is looking at, okay, we're going to look for patterns that we expect specifically to occur in our network, and we're going to baseline based on that perspective. What are the particular flows of traffic that we're hoping to see in our network? What do those flows represent? What device types are communicating within those flows, and what is the traffic related to specific services that we're expecting? What is that? What are the patterns associated with those particular service traffic? Those particular services look like? What does that traffic pattern look like? So that's our positive space pattern-based baselining. And then the negative space pattern-based baselining is getting into the exact opposite idea. What do we strictly not expect to see in our network? What are the flows of traffic that should never happen? What types of device types should never communicate? And so we're trying to get an idea in that case of, instead of baselining what we expect, we're baselining what we don't expect. So, moving into pros and cons of positive space pattern-based baselining. It is a very good tool for building context for, of course, expected traffic patterns. It's a lot more detailed than our overview type of baselining. It can get into a really good view of not just what is the existing traffic, but what makes up that existing traffic. If we're looking at some of the protocol-specific stuff, what Modbus function codes are we expecting to see between what device types on our network? You know, if we see a function code from a device that is maybe not an engineering workstation and is firing something that's reading from the coils, and we're not expecting it to be doing that, then why is it doing that? You know, is that something that should be happening in our network? And that's not a pattern of traffic that we're expecting. So how can we include that into our baseline, and how can we filter that out is kind of the idea of establishing this type of baseline. Problem with it is if you are not representing your traffic correctly, it can be really hard to get this down to a point where those pattern-based baselines aren't generating a bunch of noise. And in noisy environments where you have a lot going on, it's very, very difficult to establish this baseline well and accurately. And then, of course, with both the pattern-based types of baselines, it requires a significant amount of upkeep to actually get these baselines to a point where they are actively accurate to your current environment and any changes that have occurred in that environment since you have established that baseline. Going down to the negative space pattern-based baselining, pros of it, it very clearly defines your strictly unexpected traffic patterns, and it has a very high degree of accuracy with it. You're not going to see a lot of noise with it, but of course, anything that's not written into that type of baseline, you're not going to see. It only is going to hit the things that you have clearly defined should never happen. And then just briefly, there are some modifiers as I define them to any of the baseline types that you're looking at. we can have isolated baselines where we're looking at maybe a particular subnet, a particular component of the network, or even just particular device types, and we're not trying to baseline anything else in our network. There are filtered baselines where we're looking at things that are maybe protocol specific. Maybe I only care to baseline the Modbus traffic that's going on. Maybe I only care to baseline traffic that's coming from DNS for whatever reason I want to do that. And that is where you might want to look at not just what types of baselines are available for doing the overall network, but what types of baselines are available for specific components of the network that you care about. And then, of course, we have the granular baselines, which is the idea of we're going to establish an overall baseline of our network, but we're going to take pieces from all of these categories and we're going to put them together to form a better overall baseline. So maybe, for a portion of our network, it's more appropriate to do an overview type of baseline, but then we want to do pattern based on some of our industrial specific devices that are more critical that we care more about. So, with that in mind, we have now established some of the types of baselines that we can look at defining. We're going to get into types of detections. How do we apply those baselines? Why, do we care to categorize out the baselines? What does the information we're getting out of the baseline do for us? And so when we're looking to apply them, it tends to flow very easily into what kinds of detections can we write based on the baselines that we have established. What do those detections look like, and how can we implement them? So, to jump right into that, we're going to first go ahead and go over examples like we did last time, then I'm going to get an implementation and pros and cons. So, first type of detection that we tend to look at implementing is our statistical type of detection. Statistical detections are a little bit harder to use on what specifically you're looking to filter out and detect. So it can be really good for some of those more targeted detections where we're trying to find areas in the network that are maybe constrained, having resource issues, or it can also be really good for certain security problems, right? And so looking at some examples of what statistical rules might look like, we can look at a spike in traffic volume, a spike in traffic size. We're having more traffic going through our network than we usually do. What's going on with that? Hey, here's a spike and we can break it down even further. We can look at, hey, here's a spike in a particular port protocol communication that doesn't usually occur in our network. It can occur, but it's occurring a little bit more than it usually does. What's up with that? And so when we think about particularly security implications of what that kind of detection does for us, we can think about C2, data exfiltration, and maybe even firmware upload. You can think about DDoS attacks. There are a lot of different types of security issues that can strongly associate with some of the higher ingress of network traffic that would be outlined well by this type of detection. When we look at implementing this type of detection, we're typically looking at setting either strict thresholds to, hey, this is what we generally expect to be occurring in our network. This is the general amount of traffic that we're looking for. We have a strict threshold that we're setting. We're saying no more than this, like these number of packets should be coming from any individual device, or packets should be no larger than this size. You can also do like a moving average where, hey, we have 90 days worth of traffic. We're going to calculate a moving average point based on the last 90 days at any given point, and we're going to take a coefficient to that, maybe 1.5 times more likely, 3 to 5 times the amount of traffic, and say, hey, if something is 3 times more talkative or 5 times more talkative or whatever than our moving average, flag it. That's something that we care about. That's something we want to examine. And then, of course, z-scoring. And to briefly define what a z-score is, I have a diagram for us down at the bottom here. The idea of a z-score is that we're trying to define the relationship between any value that you provide to a data set and the mean of that data set, the average of that data set. And so when we're doing that, we're usually expressing it in standard deviations, right? So if right here is our mean, then we can go, hey, maybe 1, 2 hops, this is 2 standard deviations away from the mean. That might be okay, but then if we get, hey, we're 3 standard deviations away from the mean, maybe that's something to examine. That's what we're trying to define when we're doing statistical rules based on z-scores. And so pros of statistical types of detections, they're very simple to deploy, very simple to maintain. They don't require a lot of setup once you have the data represented in a database. Well, especially if you have it represented in a database. Database isn't necessarily required, but can be helpful. And then it makes it really easy to baseline. It can give you a very high-level view of just some of those averages as to what the amount of traffic going through your network is, what is communicating, and to what degree. Cons with statistical detections can be very noisy, unfortunately, especially in IT environments where you might have a spike of traffic on any given day compared to the previous day, or at certain times of year, there might be a lot more going on the network than usual, depending on either what employees are doing or what devices are talking, what's going on there. It tends to miss a lot of specific signatures when you're doing statistical detections because you're not really looking for the signatures in particular, unless, of course, you expect certain signatures to occur for whatever reason and you're doing a statistic of that. Probably not something you're doing in your environment unless you're looking for maybe signatures associated with certificates attached to like HTTPS traffic in your network. But at that point, you're getting a lot more specific with your statistical detections than probably necessary, and you want to be looking to doing other types of detections. And then, of course, any source of an alert that occurs on a statistical detection does not immediately lend itself to what the cause is, so you're going to have to do a follow-up investigation. Why did this statistical detection go off? I can see that there's a spike in traffic, but what caused that? And so most of the time with statistical detections, unless you inherently know what might be setting it off, you're going to have to do a follow-up investigation to figure out why did this go off, what's going on here, and so on. So moving into the next type of detection, we're kind of going back to that pattern-based idea of what network patterns now am I looking for that I want to flag? What do I want to detect? And so looking at specific protocol level exploits, like if I see a certain pattern of UMAS traffic that maybe is associated with a CVE for authentication bypass, there are some very specific applications of that you might want to hunt and look for to make sure that, hey, I don't have an attacker executing a CVE against one of my PLCs on my OT side, or may be a specific kind of traffic pattern associated with like Eternal Blue hitting a Windows device. We can look for scanning patterns. Why is there port scanning going on my network? What's doing that? What does port scanning look like on my network? And trying to define that. Getting a detection in there for port scanning really helpful for trying to hunt out an adversary doing some early recon on a network. And then, of course, doing pattern matching associated with DDoS attacks, looking for, hey, we have this influx of traffic, maybe stop function codes to a PLC, or just a general flood of malformed packets to a router, or whatever that is likely a denial of service attack, and we can flag that with our detection rule. So, looking at implementation of pattern-based detections, they tend to be a lot more expensive to do because you either need to implement it in the form of a specific algorithm looking for whatever pattern you're trying to write a detection rule for, or you're doing a strict bitwise or signature matching approach to looking at a given packet and identifying the context in that packet that you care about writing a detection for. So, pros and cons. These types of detections tend to be much higher confidence. They're a lot less noisy than our statistical rules, and they can be very tailored to your environment. If you know, hey, these are specific devices that I care about in this environment, maybe you're in the electric industry, you're going to look at what are the current threats to the electric industry. Now, what patterns are associated with those threats that we can detect in our network when we're writing these detection rules. And so you can get a very tailored set of pattern-based rules set up for those crown jewels, those critical devices to your network. And then, of course, disadvantages to our pattern-based detections is they do require some prior research to set up, especially if you're looking for things specific to your industry, and that will change over time. They require a lot of maintenance to keep up to date, especially as your environment changes. Some of the environment changes that you may have is to either scale up, scale down your network, or otherwise change devices in and out. You can invalidate what exactly you had written a pattern-based detection for before. You may be introducing a new pattern to your network or taking out a pattern that you were otherwise expecting, and so you have to adjust the rules accordingly. Now, looking at the next type of detection, we're going to talk about deviation types of detections. And so the idea of a deviation type of detection is that we're going to get into that, what exactly are we not expecting? It's very closely associated with the negative space pattern-based baselining approach that we had talked about earlier. And so if I'm looking at my overall network and I'm thinking to myself, what do I strictly expect to not happen? Instead of now having that as baseline, we're going to implement it as detection. Hey, these are two devices that are talking for the first time, and maybe they're of device types that I don't expect to be talking to each other. What's up with that? Writing a detection for those cases. Or, more importantly, especially in our OT environments, here are some devices between our OT and IT network that are communicating with each other that maybe shouldn't be. Hopefully our network is segmented in such a way that that isn't possible, but if it is possible, we can look for that communication and possibly detect an adversary trying to pivot to an OT device. And so having that type of detection available to you can be very useful. Looking at implementing them, they're usually very algorithmic in nature. And so we're going to look at implementing it as an algorithm intaking data from network traffic and hunting for those specific deviations. And then, of course, just again trying to strictly case these are the things that shouldn't occur, and if we deviate in that direction, that's something I want to flag. And so, looking at pros of our deviation type of detection, they're very good in our heavily controlled environments, especially our OT networks, looking at detecting things that are maybe communicating despite the network being segmented. And then again, similar to our pattern-based type of detection, these can be very, very tailored to our network. Maybe we're looking for, hey, these are the things that we are expecting to be associated with our PLC communication in the context of our environment. And if we see another type of device type get involved in that traffic, it is deviation from what's normally occurring. That's something we want to flag. And it depends on how your environment's set up, but they can be very specifically tailored to whatever you have going on. Looking at cons of the deviation type of detection, again, it can be very noisy, but they're usually less noisy than the statistical. It depends on how well you've tailored them down. Especially in IT environments, they tend to be very loud. There's a lot of variant traffic that goes on, a lot of devices talking to each other that we don't necessarily expect to have talking to each other. So that can create a lot of false positives when we're looking at implementing these types of detections. And then, unfortunately, unless you're isolating these detections down to specific subnets, specific device types, they're very, very hard to use in our IT environments. So, moving into cost to implement. Generally, this is additive in principle. When we're looking from the low cost to the high cost, we're getting not just, hey, at the medium cost, we're not just getting this, we're also getting all of the things available to our low cost category. So when we're considering costs of implementing a baseline, defining baseline and implementing a set of detections, generally, as you spend more and more, and this isn't necessarily cost as associated to money, it can also be cost as associated to time, and it's also not necessarily just cost upfront, but also upkeeping these things. And so generally, as we go from the low cost to the high cost, we're just going to be increasing our accuracy. We're going to be getting more and more specific as we look over the types of detections and the types of baselines that we had previously defined. And we're getting more and more information available to us. And so at the low cost, we're starting with the overview and statistical types of baselines and detections. And as we move forward, we're getting into the negative space pattern-based and the deviation types of detections all the way to at the very high cost side. We can start defining, hey, these are the things that I specifically expect to occur in as far as patterns in our network, and here are the detections associated with those patterns, looking for things that are not expected. And so when we think about trying to implement these types of baselines, types of detections, obviously it can be very challenging to go through and try and do that for yourself, especially manually. So we want to look into some tools that can be used to help you with the process of defining that baseline and applying it. So here is just a sort of collage of a bunch of tools available to us in the space. I am familiar with a lot of these and have worked with them before. I am going to be touching on a open source way to implement a network baseline and apply it. And so I'm not going to get into all of these tools that are available to you for the process of baselining in this talk, but if anyone wants to talk afterwards, feel free to come by. I am very happy to talk through any of the possible solutions that you may want to apply in your environment. So going into our open source solution, I have a very, very basic stack here of first, we got to look at how are we going to collect the data necessary to formulate our baseline. And so I, in this case, chose Zeek. Zeek is a very good open source collection platform for collecting network traffic. And once we have that network traffic available to us in the form of a Zeek log file, we need to now look into, okay, how can we store it in a way that is maybe more useful to us and our analysts for establishing this baseline, for analyzing the traffic that's going on, and how can we then apply what we learn from that to a set of detection rules or whatever else. And so there are a couple of different routes you can go here. I personally recommend doing a combination of the two. You can go from a very visual perspective, where I want to get a visual representation of the aggregated network traffic that's occurring in my network. And so that might look like I'm going to take the Zeek traffic that I collect, the network traffic that I collect in Zeek, I'm going to dump it in Elasticsearch, and I'm going to visualize that in Kibana with dashboards. I'm going to aggregate that data in such a way that I can get a good view of just generally what's going on in my network, what is sort of the breakdown of things that are predominantly occurring in terms of port protocols, what devices are predominantly communicating, and then I'm going to get down from there into the programmatic approach of, okay, now I have this network traffic, I have a pretty high-level view of what's going on in my network. How can I more specifically define what I want to pick out of that traffic, what I am expecting to see, things that I notice that maybe I don't expect to see, and how can I write queries or take other programmatic approaches, like maybe writing a function of some sort to take in IP pairs and look for things that I don't expect. Maybe there are devices of certain types that I only expect to communicate within their own subnet, and I want to write a function that says, hey, take an IP pair for any connection that occurs, and I want to check and see, are these two devices of the types that should only be talking in the same subnet, and are they talking in the same subnet? And we can then pull out the traffic that doesn't match that specific query and figure out why that's going on. And then when we look at applying what we learn from these tools, we take it into a tool like Suricata, and we can write some very specific signature-based or pattern-based detections for, hey, these are some signatures that I expect to be related to malware that could be occurring in my network, or hey, these are traffic patterns that I've noticed that are going on or have happened before historically. They shouldn't be. I want to flag them. I want to make sure that they're in a place where our analysts can check them out. And we can write all those rules in Suricata and have Suricata pick up on them. So we're now going to talk into our more Odyssey side of things, looking at some of the challenges associated with this course of implementation and how we can address those challenges. So the first thing that I highlighted as a major problem here is tuning inaccuracies. There are a lot of inaccuracies that can come about from even just data collection. You know, there can be quality issues with the data that we ingest. There could be incomplete data where maybe I see a part of a TCP handshake that Zeek happened to pick up on, but I'm missing either the initiation of that handshake, or maybe I'm missing the packet associated with the closing of that handshake, or maybe I'm missing something in the middle. How can I identify that? How can I make sure that's not going to affect the quality of the detections I write? And then, of course, unfortunately, with any traffic capturing software for the most part, we're going to have issues with directionality. There's going to be traffic that Zeek collects that it thinks is flowing one way. It's going from this host to this host, and it's going to completely flip that around. We're going to have mismatched ports. We're going to have mismatched IPs because it thinks that the traffic's going in a different direction than it is, especially when we're missing parts of a TCP handshake. So there are a couple ways to deal with this. We can utilize a machine learning algorithm. This is a more novel approach that is still very much experimental in application, but you can implement machine learning. What I typically recommend and what I have done before personally is taking our traffic into TensorFlow, using a random forest model with a set of cons that we have gone through, scrubbed, and made sure are good and representative of the traffic that I expect, and having that machine learning algorithm trained to try and either fill in missing pieces of connections where it thinks they're occurring, or addressing the directionality issues where they're occurring and trying to correct those logs in our databases. And then a approach that I've found to be more useful in the field so far is trying to either use a SQL query or some sort of algorithm to detect directionality as it occurs, directionality issues as it occurs, and then correcting that traffic, making sure that, hey, we flag it as this is traffic that the collection host happened to misidentify it is in the wrong direction. Let's make sure it's pulled out, corrected, etc. before our detection rules ingest it. And then you can do the same thing for looking for, trying to identify, hey, here's a complete TCP flow, and here's one that maybe is missing a few pieces of the connection. Our collection host happened to miss those pieces, and we can make sure that those are separated out and filtered before we put them into our detection rules. And then going into some more tuning inaccuracies, there are some other types of things that can occur. You can have issues with the logic actually used for your detection algorithms, just on the implementation side, and unfortunately, it can be really hard to notice those things if you don't do a repeated review of your detection logic, or otherwise, what I found to be much more useful is trying to set up unit tests to make sure, hey, anytime I make a change to a detection, these are some strict cases of things that should always be flagged, never be flagged, and we're going to make sure that this detection algorithm is tested for all of those cases before it is deployed. And then, of course, there can be issues with thresholding. This is a much more of an issue with our statistical rules, but when we're looking at establishing thresholds, talking to the issue that I mentioned earlier with statistical rules in general, we can end up with a lot of false positives. Where do we set that threshold then? How do we figure out what a good threshold is? And so really doing repeated review, especially in networks that get scaled up over time, to identify patterns within any false positives that emerge, and trying to adjust thresholds as needed is really a good way to make sure that you don't have thresholding issues in the first place. Unfortunately, with thresholding issues, it is a much easier issue to deal with if you are proactive about it rather than reactive. But using query languages to identify upper limits of existing traffic and make sure that you're checking against that query at any given point in time can be a great approach to make sure that the thresholds that you have set at a given point in time remain accurate to what is occurring in your network over time. So, moving on to the next set of challenges that we have. We're going to talk about data overload. What happens when we have a amount of traffic that either is over the capacity of our tools, or more likely, we have a number of anomalies that exceeds the capacity of our analyst team. All right, there are so many things getting flagged that our analyst team isn't actually able to process the anomalies that are occurring. And how can we deal with those anomalies and make sure that they're all being analyzed and we can catch up with what's going on live. Really, doing statistical analysis, aggregating that data, looking at, hey, these are the amounts of connections, size of packets, types of traffic that are occurring in the anomalies that we see. Here are the categories that we can sort of separate these out to. Maybe we have a set of anomalies that is associated with a specific protocol. Maybe we have a set of anomalies that are associated with a specific subnet or a specific set of devices, and trying to aggregate those anomalies as much as possible into groups so that they can be more easily processed and dealt with by an analyst team is a great way to deal with those large numbers of alerts. And then, of course, dealing with, hey, we have so much data going on in our network that it's really hard to establish a baseline in the first place. How can we deal with that, especially in our IT environments? And so, looking for, hey, here's some diverse network traffic here's a network where we have a lot of diverse network traffic. It's very difficult to establish baseline. How can we deal with that? And so grouping up traffic corresponding with device types and trying to break it down to those isolated and filtered levels that I mentioned earlier. And trying to say, hey, here is the traffic that we expect to be corresponding to any given device type, and trying to look at, hey, these are the ports that we expect this traffic to be over. Here's what this traffic generally should look like, and getting down to just what do we care about as far as the devices available on our network, and working backwards from there. Here are the most critical things, like establish a baseline for each level of criticality of devices that we have available in our network. Here are the things that we expect to be associated as far with each of these devices as far as network traffic is concerned, and what does that traffic look like, and trying to work a baseline backwards from there rather than building an overall baseline at once for your network can be a great way to deal with these issues. Moving into the last issue, and then we'll have Q&A. We're going to talk about scalability a little bit. So particularly when we're looking at the scalability of our infrastructure, once we've established a set of baselines, there can be a couple issues that occur. Particularly if you have written your baselines and your detections very quickly, and they're not very flexible to the size of your network as your infrastructure scales up. And you maybe either don't have configuration options available to you with those detections, or the configurations don't automatically adjust, then you are going to have issues with a lot of false flags. And so again, similar to when we're having thresholding issues, we're going to try and identify the patterns within the false positives that we have, and keep our baseline up to date, improve it as much as possible to deal with those new patterns that occur as we scale up our network is really going to be the best way to make sure that your detections are up to date. But unfortunately, that might not always be realistic, especially when we're scaling up our networks. There might be a lot going on, a lot of other issues that have to be addressed. So in the short term, and I very much encourage that we do not do this in the long term, but in the short term, setting up an algorithm associated with the false flags that we see to temporarily suppress those alerts can be a very good approach to making sure that we're not going over alerts that are not helpful as we're scaling up our network. But eventually, you do want to update your baseline, update your detections, make sure that you're getting back on track with what you want to see and what you don't want to see. Moving on to our last scalability issue that I'm going to go over. And of course, there are a lot of issues in any of these categories, and there are plenty of categories I'm glossing over. So if you have any questions, again, please feel free to ask aside or at the end. We have the issue where we have detections that are maybe written in such a way that they don't scale well to the network size as it increases. New traffic or unexpected quantities of traffic with a rule can really cause a lot of issues as far as false positives, false alerts coming up that are legitimate traffic, but are getting caught in the baselines and detections that we write. And we can also hit a point where algorithmically, if we don't have a device with a lot of resourcing available to it, or if our algorithm isn't optimized enough, there may end up being a point where you hit such a quantity of data that your detections can't actually keep up with the live data flow that you have going through your network, which results in a delay in response time. And so how can we deal with that issue? Keeping those signature and pattern-based detections up to date to reflect prominent threats predominantly to your particular industry, particular environment, is the best approach to trying to deal with this, because unfortunately, you have to upkeep your detections. You have to upkeep your baselines, make sure that they're up to date. And so when you're looking at, working backwards towards getting your baseline back to where it should be, start with what are the prominent threats at the moment? What are the things that I really need to target, make sure aren't occurring in my environment? And then going backwards from there, getting into the less and less likely cases as far as threats that can be introduced to the environment, and updating the baselines accordingly is really the best way to deal with this issue. That in mind, when you're going through the process of planning, I want everybody here to hopefully now have an idea of, okay, once we have established a desired outcome, we first need to scope out what needs to be baselined and to what degree of accuracy that baseline needs to be. You have some baseline types to consider and some ideas of what those can look like as corresponds with your needs. You have an idea of the costs associated with each of those types and each of those levels of information. You have some ideas of tools that are available to you and a basic implementation of what those tools can look like if you were to go back and set up a baseline in your environment for the very first time. You have an idea of some of the potential problems you run into and some of the solutions and support you have for solving those problems. That in mind, I will now open up for Q&A. I don't know how much time we have, but
Whatever.
we can take a couple at least. And thank you very much. My information's up there, and if you want to talk to me either after in the hallway or reach out to me at my email address, please feel free. I'm happy to take questions and answer them to the best of my ability. That in mind, does anyone want to kick us off with any questions while we have time?
I think everybody's ready for lunch.
Everybody's ready for lunch. Well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, MacLeod.